Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guests, plural today, which is unusual for us, are Larry Sherman, author along with Dennis Plies, of Every Brain Needs Music, the Neuroscience of Making and Listening to Music. It's published by Columbia University Press, and it's out now. And I should mention that the wonderful illustrations in the book are by Susie Davis, and especially the early ones of the brain and the parts of the brain that music responds to, or that the brain responds to the music, are really, really incisive, I thought. So Larry's a professor of neuroscience at the Oregon Health and Science University. He's published widely on brain development, aging, disease, and given lectures on music and the brain throughout the world. And you can catch some of them, as I just did, on YouTube. Dennis was for many years a music professor at Warner Pacific University, and he's been involved with, as they both have, with music for their entire lives. And he's recorded gospel, classical, and jazz albums. And we'll get into the book in a minute, and I'll eventually end my introduction. But a lot of the book was driven by these two appendices that they have in the book. They're basically surveys. The first was sent out to over 100 musicians, and it's structured around the metrics of the responses to queries about a person's own personal involvement in music. And then the second one, which is really cool and resonates, no pun intended, with me, it simply asks in a nutshell, basically, tell me a story about you and music and how it grabs you and why. And if you're a performer or conductor, why is it the one piece, like for me being Barber's Adagio or Ravel's Bolero or Gimme Shelter or Afternoon of a Faun? Why is it that one that does this clicking thing, just hits you right in the receptor that's necessary to be hidden? And I mention these because these are questions that are simple and yet quite complex. In fact, the simplest one, but the hardest one to answer, and it's brought to play early in the book, is what is music? And then how your brain composes it, and I guess translates it. And later in the chapters that are arranged as a symphony, the practice of music, the tasks and joys of performing and listening, and why we even like it so much. So welcome, Larry. Welcome, Dennis. Thanks so much for joining us today.
It's great to be here.
Great.
Well, let's start with that question, because you do actually mention it early on, both of you. What is music?
Yeah, I mean, there's like a million different answers for that. So the one, of course, we settle on, since we're talking about the neuroscience of music, is a very scientific notion of music, which is that it's vibrating air molecules that are flowing through the air that contain all sorts of information that's going into our auditory apparatus of the ear, being transferred to a part of our auditory cortex in our brain, and then sent to areas of our brain that interpret it as music. And that's a very scientific and not a very poetic definition. I mean, I've always loved the quote that music is organized sound, but it's organized in a very specific and special way that we understand as human beings to be music. So it's really a remarkable auditory experience compared to other types of sounds.
And you give the quote by Frank Zappa, and I can't remember the other one, are really good. Can you remember one of them?
Well, Frank Zappa was saying it's basically a composer is someone who imposes their will on unsuspecting air molecules that are generated by unsuspecting musicians, along those lines. But there's all sorts of poetic definitions as well. But we're trying to get to the science of that, so we can't get into poetry.
And the thing about you, Dennis, the other side of the coin is that when I watched you on YouTube playing, you just seem so happy. So where does that connect to it?
Well, I'm not only producing the sounds, but hearing the sounds and knowing that it's whatever it is, it's my fault. And I take that responsibility, because I've always known and just felt that I knew how to make music. I know how to carry a line and these things that are not easy to teach others, but can be taught. But I just breathe music. I've always enjoyed it. And I'd like to add to that it's organized sound and silence. The silence is golden in life and in music. And it's both.
Well, that brings me to a question I was going to ask later, but you just talked about silence. So I was thinking, what do these guys think of, say, John Cage and 4 minutes and 33 seconds of nothing? Does that offend you? Do you like it?
Oh, I think it's hysterical.
And I think it's philosophical. I think the big point for me is that there are sounds going on all the time, and he's helping us be aware of them. So when the siren goes by, that's part of the music at that point. You have to admit it. And then our hearts, we can hear our hearts when it's really silent, beating, and just the general sound in a room of people. Somebody's moving somehow.
When you say music is just your life in a sense, I was looking at, there are two things. Oh, the one, it's kind of crappy, but it's a black and white movie about Beethoven, and he has his head on the piano while he's composing Moonlight Sonata. Not Moonlight Sonata, that's Gershwin. What is
Moonlight Sonata is Beethoven.
Oh yeah, okay. So yeah, and he's composing it, and it's as if he can't help it. And then the other side of the coin, and where you said it was hysterical, is a scene in Amadeus when Salieri makes this big deal of producing this little piece for the king, and then Mozart comes in, and he doesn't need to look at it. I've already heard it, and then he plays it, and he plays it 1,000 times better, and he's laughing his ass off, and it's just two completely different things.
Yeah.
And it's funny, and the reason why, as a bookseller, and when I sell this book, the reason why it's so good is because, look at it, it made me think of those things. Look, it just made me think of them.
Well, and you're coming to an interesting point. I mean, John Cage's silence is silence. It may not be, as Dennis is saying, classically considered music necessarily, maybe more of an experiment in sound. But of course, music is an experiment in sound half the time, right? So what we're doing when we're creating music is trying to generate something new or some new idea about how to experience the world and the sounds of the world. And there's nothing to say that what we experience in the world can't be incorporated into music. But the other thing is what you're talking about with Salieri versus Mozart. There's so many different things that contribute to one's ability to create music and compose in that case, for example. And so Salieri comes up with a riff of some sort. Mozart just takes it and runs with it. They're both music. They both have their own genius to them. They're just different. And the process of composition is so, and improvisation, which we contrast and compare in that one chapter in the book. I think those are both different processes on one level and very similar processes on another. And the neuroscience certainly supports that.
Well, in your prelude, the book's, as I said, like prelude, overture, first movement, second movement, all the way up to the eighth, and then a coda. In the beginning, we haven't yet even begun to talk about, well, two things. One, the history, when you take it back to the flute, and then ponder whether there's a bamboo flute before that that's no longer with us. And then the second and most important, I think, in the entire book is what's going on in our brain and where is it going on. So either or both of you, if you could comment on both those things, 40,000 years ago or before, and then why?
Well, so that I think is to me the most fascinating thing, the fact that maybe even Neanderthals had music, right? And there's no real reason to doubt that they did. I mean, their brains were big. They were living in social situations. They even intermingled with us. We have up to 10% Neanderthal DNA, depending on which study you look at. So I think there are enough similarities there. But the fact that 40,000+ years ago, there's evidence or potential evidence of flutes in Neanderthal caves tells you that music has been an essential aspect of human existence since the very beginning. Homo sapiens, same thing. We have intact flutes that date back at least 20,000 years. So before we even got into social settings and everything else that we have today, we were making music. It's such an essential part of our existence as humans. And if you think about evolution, why would we have music? Why is it so important to be human and have music? One of the things we talked about is all these studies that suggest that being engaged with music is an incredibly great way to build community. So people who are singing together, playing music together, you actually have these neurochemical changes, including endorphins, which are involved in a lot of different things. One of them is actually pain relief, interestingly, and the other one is dopamine. But that combination basically gives you this sense of acceptance within a group. So I always like to say, if you're in a barbershop quartet, you're going to have a little bit of this going on. And interestingly, if you're in a bigger choir, like the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, it's an even bigger effect on the individual. The bigger the group, the better. But evolutionarily, that makes sense, right? This is a way to bring people together, to unify them, and to give a sense of acceptance within a group.
And Dennis, so like, I'm assuming that all your life, because of this passion, this love you have for it, you know, when you're in that type of group, do you have that feeling? Does that come over you?
I much prefer playing with others than by myself. In fact, I was soloing on piano and marimba at when I was 6 and 7 and 8, and my parents suggested that I take the trumpet so I could be in a band, that I would be working with others, not always a soloist and with accompanist, and that deeply affected me. I was in the marching band and the concert band, and as a marimbist and vibist, I've been in classical duos with piano and sometimes with clarinet and other cello, in smaller chamber works, and also in on the vibes, usually in a quintet, something like that, with piano, bass, and drums and a horn. And it's so fun. You have your personal responsibility, but you're not, if you're a good person, I try to be a good person. I'm not trying to stand out. I'm trying to, I might have the solo at a certain point, but it takes the rest of the team. You can compare it to basketball.
Right, exactly. Well, this is an off-the-wall question then. Both of you started out so early. I wonder whether your social lives, do you think, were your social lives affected because you were so engrossed in your music? In a good way, were they affected? Were you looked at like nerds, or were you looked at like being cool, or were you not in the popular kids group, or you were?
I'll let Dennis answer that first.
Pretty much none of the above that you mentioned. That it's more, I will have to say that I'm used to the limelight and being credited after a performance, so I have less capable social skills, because I was always people came to me and was congratulating me and doing all that kind of, and so I didn't get arrogant about it. It's just that I was more receptive rather than learning how to do it myself. It's a weird response.
I mean, I was a total nerd, but not because of music. Music for me was fun. I got into a lot of trouble with my piano teacher because I used to play I played by ear. I'm horrible at music theory. But if I can hear something, I can play it. I actually was supposed to play the Rhapsody in Blue, George Gershwin, right, for a piano contest that my piano teacher had set me up for. And what did I do? I went out and got a recording of it. But the recording was by a pianist who added a little trill here and there to make his little signature mark on the Rhapsody in Blue. And that's like an automatic deduction in a competition. My piano teacher was so mad. She finally said to me, just go join a rock band or something. because you're not, there's nothing more I can do for you because you're so stubborn. You don't want to learn the music. So, and for the longest time, reading music for me was like a fifth grader trying to read Tolstoy. It was just not happening. When my own kids started taking lessons, that actually they had a piano teacher who asked me if I would do duets with them, and I had to start reading music at that point. So that actually was my kind of 40-year challenge to my brain, was to try to get better at sight reading. But I was a nerd for other reasons, and so yeah, I was always interested in science and everything else, and so I had my own sort of social clique of science related kids who were into computers and things like that. But the music actually was a way to become more popular. So if I was at a party when I was in high school and there was a piano there, I'd go sit down and start playing some music, and people are like, "Oh, wow, that's pretty good." Play Elton John's Funeral for a Friend or something like that, and they're like, "Wow, you can play that. That's really good." So different uses for music for me.
It's funny when your teacher said, just go out and play in a band. It reminded me of when Gershwin went to Paris and wanted to get taught by Ravel. And Ravel says, no, you are the best Gershwin and I am the best Ravel, and just leave it like that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. I think my teacher was wise
yeah,
in that way.
I mean, when you said that, I thought, that's really good advice.
Yeah.
And the other thing that made me think of you was in 7th grade, I can still see myself in the library at junior high, the wooden table with Mrs. Gladys, and her handing me the book Hiroshima by John Hersey.
Oh, yeah.
It's like you, 7th grade, except a lot earlier than you.
That book had a huge impact on me. My parents were both pretty conservative. My dad actually fought in World War II in the Japanese theater. When I read that book, it really changed my whole outlook on humanity and war and everything else. And that's actually when I started becoming more of an activist in my life politically. So, yeah. It's
funny because when I earlier said Adagio, Samuel Barber, who grew up 20 minutes from my house, I was thinking of that. If you scored the movie Hiroshima, that would be the song that would be the piece you could use.
Oh, for sure.
Why is that?
Yeah, it's funny. I just gave a talk about love on the brain here in Portland, and the neuroscience of pleasure, basically. And of course, one of the things in the talk was what happens when people can't experience pleasure, when they have what's called anhedonia. And this could be to music, but it could be to anything else. And the music that we used to kind of illustrate that was the Barber strings, Adagio for strings, which is, it's that minor chords, all those minor chords. It's all that slow rhythm, that slow pace of the song. It really drags you down. It's really just very sad music, and it's beautiful. And that's one of the things that Dennis and I have gone back and forth on this a long time. People seek sad music all the time and consider it beautiful. And yet somehow we're supposed to be always seeking things that make us happy. And yet sad music sometimes makes us very happy. But you're actually right that that's the kind of music that you would use for something of that serious of a nature, because it's a serious piece of music.
Yeah. I listened to it yesterday, once again, because of your book. Another reason as a bookseller. See, it's interesting how books work. You can finish a book that's written a certain way and you're done. And that's it. You put it back on the shelf and you're done with it. But other books, when you close the back cover, you're not done at all. That's this kind of book, which is so cool because you can just go out and look at other books. Now you can just go to Wikipedia, you can go to YouTube, which I did, and you learn so much more. Don't you think that's cool?
Oh, I think it's amazing.
So how did you guys collaborate? How did it work?
Well,
what?
We talk about this in the book, right? How we met, which is kind of funny. I mean,
I didn't want to say it. You can say it.
Well, so yeah, I play racquetball a couple times a week at a gym nearby, and I've been giving these talks about music and the brain for years. And I had seen Dennis at this gym in the morning. We both were up there at 6 o'clock in the morning every week, and I'd seen him and maybe said hi to him, but I never introduced myself. We just kind of like acknowledged each other. And one morning, after the night before I'd given one of these talks, I was talking to my racquetball partner, and he was like, "Hey, how did your talk go?" And I said, "Hey, it went pretty well. Good audience. We had about 300 people show up, blah, 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 blah." And Dennis suddenly is there in the room getting dressed, and I'm getting dressed. And he says, "Did you say you gave a talk about music in the brain?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "I've been to your talk. In fact, I've been to it twice. I just didn't recognize you without any clothes on."
I didn't want to say that because it sounds like
Well,
all
well,
collaborators should see each other naked before
well, the funniest thing about that is that, after that introduction, to the annoyance of my racquetball partners, because Dennis says I would get into these conversations about philosophy and music and history and all these other things, and I'd be late to get out to the court. But over the years, we had these incredible conversations, and then Dennis told me that he was going to be retiring from Warner Pacific University. And I thought, I've had 3 friends tell me I should write a book about my talks. And I couldn't help but think, I don't want to write another book that's just like other books about the neuroscience of music. It didn't make sense. But then I thought, Dennis has all these amazing insights as a teacher, as a musician. And I asked him, I said, "Hey, would you like to collaborate on this book?" And then that turned into even longer conversations that pissed off my partners in racquetball because I would never get on the court because we had all these great ideas.
Did you live very close to each other, right?
We do. Yeah.
Turns out, yeah, but I didn't know that at the beginning.
Yeah.
So did you write in the same room? Did you send each other chapters how did you do that?
No, Dennis, I think, was the one who had the, we kind of both came up with this idea of sending out a survey to people, but Dennis was the one who kind of came up with the initial sets of questions. And I kind of had an idea of how I wanted to organize the book, basically around my talk. Quickly realized that I needed to do something a little different from that, thanks to Dennis. And then we finally put the survey together and sent it out. And once the results came in, we both kind of just poured over them and then started coming up with ways to structure the book and ways to structure each chapter based on the responses that we got and based on our own ideas. And I was just reading papers like crazy that I could find on the topic that kind of fit with where we were going. Some of them are really, really good, and those were the ones we included in the book, and some of them were not so convincing, and we left those out. But I would write something and send it to Dennis, or he would write something and send it to me, and we go back and forth. And then COVID hit.
Oh yeah.
So I can tell you, I'm a full professor, and I have my own research laboratory I'm running, and I do all these other things in my life. So this book was kind of moving at the speed of evolution. And COVID hit, and my wife is a writer, and we had all of our kids home and one boyfriend home. And we realized the only time that we'd have to ourselves would be early in the morning. So she and I would get up and turn off the internet and just write for an hour every morning. And then I would send what I wrote to Dennis, and he would send stuff back to me. And that's what really drove us to get this book out.
When you okay, you send both surveys, which serve, as I said, as appendices A and B 1 and 2, and you don't have to read them for the book, or you don't have to read the notes either, which are copious, but it definitely adds a lot to it. But when you start out, we're talking about people's opinions, people's feelings, the music itself, but then you go into a great amount of detail about fMRIs and holding still, what happens, and watching the brain. Talk a little bit about this. Is for a layperson and for lay readers, they have no idea that this is actually something that happens. Talk a little bit about the parts of the brain that sometimes activate and sometimes deactivate, depending on what they're hearing.
Yeah, so it's both hearing and in the act of improvising and to some degree composing. It's amazing that people do this, but Dennis and I were trying to imagine what it would be like to have to do one of these studies, especially the improvisers, where you're on your back in a machine, which is very closed in, incredibly noisy. You're wearing noise canceling headphones. So if you're claustrophobic, forget about it. This isn't going to work. In some of the studies, they had to bite down on a bar to keep their head still. And then they're being asked to do things like play a keyboard on their lap without looking at it, or to just listen to music, or to do any kind of task in these machines that are basically covering which areas of your brain become active under the different activities. And so people have done this for people improvising, for people composing, for people just listening to music. They've even done it where they've had a person on one instrument in the control room, and then they could hear what that person is playing, and they were like doing a trading fours type of thing as in jazz, off of the person in the control room, and they're measuring each other's responses. It's amazing the number of things people have tried to do. And the data show that, the act of improvising in particular, and this has mostly been done in jazz musicians who are very good improvisers, leads to a lot of deactivation of different areas of the brain. And the areas that are kind of becoming deactivated are kind of letting go of restrictions. So if we're talking about kids who color outside the lines, and Dennis can talk about this much more than I can, that those areas have to become deactivated to allow that to happen, because you're sort of breaking rules, or you're not kind of sticking within a particular mold. And that was kind of fascinating to see.
I still want to get into the anatomical stuff, but I want to ask you, Dennis, about that, especially with regard to improvisation. But jazz is very difficult for me to get into, and blues used to be, but now blues I love. But jazz, the only thing I could really listen to be something like David Sanborn, which is, not really jazz, but it's accessible. But like Miles Davis, I like Sketches in Spain. I know it's a work of genius. I know that. I can almost intuit it, but listening to it doesn't. So there's two kinds of people: those who embrace jazz and those don't. So what would you attribute that to? Both of you guys.
Well, I mean, I at my age, I'm 81, and I'm realizing that I actually am less tolerant to a lot of jazz that I used to be very tolerant and loved, craved. So I think part of it is the brain and the changes and effects, but also it's, I'd rather talk about, I'm better talking about my pilgrimage of classical music, and then at age 28 in going to the American Conservatory of Music in Chicago, being confronted saying, do you want to improvise? And I said, yes. Because unlike Larry, I've been reading music my whole life on pipe organ, piano, trumpet, and marimba and vibes. And reading music is nearly easier than reading English words. And when I answered, yes, I would like to improvise, it changed my life. It opened up, and I realized I'd hear people say, what you have to do is turn off your brain. You have to not think. And that was an antithesis to what I wanted to be as a person. I want to think. And so I can switch from reading music to improvising in a just like click, bam. But it took about 5 years of not listening to Beethoven and to listening to jazz and developing the ability to not think. So I practiced like crazy, many formulas and patterns and pieces, and learning the chord progressions. But I learned how to not legislate it through judgment or reflection, but being in the moment and just finding out what I heard. And there's a way of practicing that is play a note, listen to it, and if it's 5 minutes or 5 seconds, when you hear the next note, then play that one. That's a good exercise.
That reminds me of something that you must study too, Larry, is like this concept of flow, where you aren't thinking and you don't even know what you're doing, but you're doing what you want to be doing.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
The greatest.
Where in your brain is this thing that allows you to deactivate and just be part of everything?
It's actually in multiple places. There's a whole network of areas, especially in the frontal cortex and other areas that kind of tell you when to play by the rules and when to break the rules. You know, when I sit down to improvise, which I often do, I'll just sit down, I'll hit a chord and just go, you know, just start playing either blues, jazz, or even I'll make up classical sounding music. My wife says I sound like I'm always playing Bach whenever I try to improvise in classical music. So I'm obviously being influenced by something.
Well,
But
if you're gonna pick somebody, I guess that's a good one to pick.
why not, right? So, but you know, what's happening though is it's not as free form as we think, obviously, and I think Dennis will agree with that too. We're usually prompted by something, and it may be in our own heads, but it may be by the musician sitting next to us. They play something, and then you're going to play something and pick it up. You're going to probably kind of stick in roughly that same key, probably the same rhythm. You might change things a little bit around, but you're taking other patterns and then adding to them. And those, what you're adding may be very unique, but you're starting from a place which has its own rules. So it's not that we're completely breaking the rules. I mean, even freeform jazz, quote unquote, has some rules to it, right? And that's okay. But it is still reacting to something a little differently. And when you're composing, though, you're doing something really very different, right? So when you're improvising, it's really in the moment. It's something that you're just doing then. It's not meant to be recapitulated later or reproduced later necessarily. When you're composing, you're really being intentional. You're working something out. You're spending time going back and forth and drafting. It's like writing a book. You're trying to make something that's going to last. You're revising constantly. You're trying to make things flow together. And so those are really different processes. And when you look at what's happening in the brain during kind of composition style things, there's a lot more activation going on than deactivation, interestingly. And that's probably because you're using networks that are established to engage in activities that are established, as opposed to disengaging of those activities to let yourself kind of just go.
It's funny because the first time I looked at the first diagram, I'm thinking, oh, all this stuff should just happen in the cerebral cortex, which you mentioned. And it doesn't. It's all
everywhere.
Temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe. And then I thought, wait a minute, and this is so silly. I thought, that's too far away from your ears.
Yeah. I mean, and that's, you know, so, you know, what I study in my lab is myelin, and myelin is that substance that wraps around nerve cells, the wiry parts of them called the axons. And what myelin does is it lets those nerve impulses travel much faster than they would if you don't have myelin. So I always like to say to people, if you have myelin, it's like driving on the Autobahn in Germany at midnight, where you can be going 200 miles an hour and nobody's going to bother you. And if you lose your myelin, it's like driving on, pick your most congested highway where you live at rush hour. And then here it would be I-5 at the 84 interchange at rush hour. You're lucky to be going 2 miles an hour. And that's actually literally the difference in speed. So you can imagine then, if these high speed interactions aren't happening at the right pace, everything falls apart. And this is what happens in people, for example, with multiple sclerosis. They lose their myelin because their immune system is attacking their myelin. And one of the amazing things about music is there's some good evidence to suggest that engaging in music and playing music and practicing music does things like creates more myelin. It increases the connectivity between cells and circuits in the brain, and allows for this high-speed communication to happen. And that's so necessary for everything we do when it comes to music.
Well, since now we're in the brain and we're talking about myelin, and you mentioned axons, give us the entire picture, because with regard to the dendrites, and again, the illustration shows that this stuff is going everywhere, right, and the neuron and the cell body. So talk about how all this is interconnected and how many connections there are that interconnect with each other. So you have multiple ways of hearing something. I'm saying,
right. So just thinking about the structure of the brain, right? We have billions of neurons in our brains, which have trillions of synapses, the connections between neurons. And all those circuits have to interact in very different ways. And they use different neurochemicals to control whether you're turning on a circuit or off a circuit, or, you know, altering a circuit. And if you think about what's just happening when you're just listening to music, so, you know, these vibrating air molecules are going to go into your ear. They're going to go into a part of your ear called the cochlea, which has these nerve endings that then fire neurons into your auditory cortex. Remarkably, one of the things we talk about in the book is there's these cells that seem to be music specific. which is kind of blows me away. And we don't know if that's the chicken or an egg question. Did those cells arise as we experienced music as children, or were they kind of already there waiting to hear music and then they became more music specific? We don't know, but they're there. And so there's just the fact that we have cells in our brain that are turned on by music and not by other classes of sounds is kind of amazing. And so the way that neuron will work is you have a connection coming from those cells in the cochlea, being fed by the dendrite, as you pointed out. The electrical signal is going to go through that cell, go all the way down that axon, and then fire, and that's going to be a synapse onto another cell body or another dendrite. And then there's another whole set of circuits there that go on, and there's thousands of cells that are doing this at any given time in any part of that circuit. And then from the auditory cortex, cells branch out to all these different places in the brain. I mean, one of the things that kind of blew me away is there's a structure, the lower part of the brain, the back of the brain, called the cerebellum. And everybody thought that was all about just coordinating movement for the longest time and doing some other things. Turns out there's a lot of music processing that happens in the cerebellum, including things like possibly rhythm, but also some other parts of sound processing. That's just remarkable. So it's going to all these different places, and that's just listening to music. And that's nothing compared to what happens when you're practicing a musical instrument.
Yeah, it almost seemed like with the cerebellum, because you guys go back to talk about musicality and how there's a tribe that maybe doesn't even need to use words, just use music to convey, and how a mother is basically sing-songing like I did with my kids. And then the one that really got me was when you talked about the word "oh," and I never thought about it, but you can go "oh" or "oh" or so many different ways. And it made me think of Mandarin and four tonals, which I had never really equated it to. But yes, there are so many ways you can intonate the word "oh," and that's just 2 letters.
Mm-hmm. And our brain is immediately picking up on those different meanings.
Yeah.
I mean, prosody, what you're talking about, is so part of every language. You're right. In Asian languages, for example, prosody is much more important than it is in English, because it can have completely different meanings that are way beyond what we have in our language. And it's part of the reason possibly why people in Asia tend to have higher rates of perfect pitch, right? They can identify sounds from very early ages because they're hearing not only the music that they're hearing, but also the language they're hearing has a certain musicality to it.
Well, again, as a layman, so it's funny how your body changes with O2. You go, "oh," or you go, "oh," and your body is moving with the sound, which is very interesting. But am I right in calling it tonal? You're saying prosody. Is it tonal?
Prosody is tonal, right? I mean, it's
okay. That's what I wanted to know.
One of my teachers taught me how we use the word, say, watermelon. You like watermelon? I love watermelon, but the rhythm of the word never changed. And I had never thought about that when we speak, we have all of this prosody and emotion in but the rhythm is intact.
What's for lunch? Watermelon. Yeah. Or what's for lunch? Watermelon.
Yeah.
Same rhythm, completely different meaning.
It is funny. I guess that's what sarcasm is based on to a certain extent.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Me, sarcastic, That's so
But the cerebellum's holding it together.
Yeah. So you guys didn't do fMRIs yourself? You should have been forced to do them.
No, I kind of wish we had. We actually there's a guy here in Oregon. His name is Bill Rooney, who's the head of our imaging center at our university. And he was involved with a study years ago where he took the conductor of the Oregon Symphony and asked him to visualize conducting a symphony under an fMRI. So the first thing they had to figure out was how to get him over his claustrophobia. It turns out this conductor was not happy being in a confined space. But eventually he calmed down and they were able to get him in there. And I can't remember what the piece was. It might've been the Brahms violin concerto that they were doing. But basically they just asked him to visualize in his mind conducting the piece. And there's been other studies that have done this too. And you can kind of follow along as the brain activity is changing and understand where you are in the music. because a conductor is visualizing the entire orchestra when the violins are playing, when the horns are playing, and everything else. And in their brains, they're like, these different areas are lighting up when these different things are happening as the music progresses. And to me, that's remarkable. I mean, so we can really follow the activity. And I wish I had been there to see that, but I've heard all about it.
I think you guys should be required to do it.
Dan Levitan got Sting to do it.
Really?
Yeah. In fact, we cite his paper where he put Sting under an fMRI machine and had him do some really interesting things, actually, including just listening to different genres of music and seeing how different genres of music affected him, or thinking about composing in different genres of music. It's a sample size of exactly one person, so it's hard to say anything big about it, but it was fascinating, because here's a very accomplished musician and you're actually looking at what's happening in their brain under these different conditions.
When you're talking, and we're always talking about the brain, and I guess we should do the duality concept of mind versus brain, because I don't know if mind enters into your bailiwick of looking at the anatomical structure versus whatever Descartes posited was the other side of it. How does
we got into that a little bit in the book. I mean, as a neuroscientist, I have to come to the conclusion that you can't have a mind without a brain. So what we call mind embodies so much of who we are, but that's basically our brain just doing its job. And our mind is based on what is happening in our brain. So you can't have one without the other.
Well, if we go back to what I was thinking about, maybe before we started talking live here, about the fugue, because as I said, Douglas Hofstadter's book, Gödel, Escher, Bach, was a big influence in my life, because it finally made me understand that these things are interdisciplinary, that Bach is doing something where you have this repetitive, it's impossible to explain. And then you have Gödel saying it's the incompleteness theory. You can't possibly study something when you're inside of the thing you're studying, because it's going to be by its very nature incomplete. And then Escher drawing these pictures that can't possibly exist, yet you look at them and they do. And and it may have been in the book and I may have missed it, but do you talk about this kind of interdisciplinary thing? Like, okay, what about synesthesia? You must do that. You must talk about that too.
I don't think we actually cover synesthesia in the book.
No.
We were kind of avoiding talking about sort of exceptions to the rules to some degree, just because it gets covered in the weeds. But I hear what you're saying. It's a big philosophical question. I don't know how you feel about this, Dennis, but I mean,
I think there's an implication by speaking about music and all the facets of music, which are listed on one of those lists: the contour, melody, harmony, rhythm, texture, and tone color. And when so the word simultaneity comes to mind. That's interdisciplinary, and the factors that are happening at the same time when making music are vivid, that you can extract, and the same for listening. I can listen to a string quartet and choose to listen to one of the instruments over the others. I can listen to the texture. I can listen to if it's by Bach or Beethoven or Bartok, listen to the composition. Compositionally, it can be analytical. There's just so many joys that are happening simultaneously through music making.
Well, then what about, I'm trying to paint you guys into a corner here. What about something like Night on Witch Mountain, or Afternoon of a Faun, or Hall of the Mountain King? They're called those things because they're supposed to be an analogy or a metaphor of those things. And if you're sitting in the concert hall listening,
Well, that's a type of music called program music, as opposed to a symphony, which is more of a development of a germ, an idea. And so the program, the painting, the tone poem, whatever it is, that's trying to suggest a feeling and a scenario is a different goal in the composer.
Yeah, but nonetheless, if you see it, then that's the interdisciplinary thing I'm talking about. The evocative thing, that the grabbing thing, that you actually do see the fawn, you see the meadow, you see him waking up, you see him gambling, you see him prancing. Why is that? Why is that? Why do you see that? Because he wanted you to see it.
Good composer.
Yeah. I mean, I think just like a painter, they're trying to evoke a certain feeling or image. They're doing it with sound instead of paint. Having said that, I'm not sure that all of these pieces would evoke the same thing in different people if you didn't have something along the lines of a title or lyrics or something else to get you there. But so I think I think of the Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, the da 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 da. I mean, it does, now that I think about it, sound like somebody who's on a carriage going through the forest and exploring nature and everything else. But it could also just be a funny little piece of music, right? So I think you have to kind of let yourself imagine. I think imagination, of course, comes to big play here. And a good composer will drive your imagination to do those things. But we do respond to certain types of auditory cues by imagining different things that are happening in response to that music. I mean, we do kind of have a soundtrack in our lives, and that's I mean, people have their song that they've met their loved one by, for example. My wife and I have a song that we always think about because we heard it on one of our early dates. I think everybody has these moments that they tie their memory and a certain musical frame to, and it comes back every time you hear that song. So if you're a good composer, you can take advantage of those types of things and drive those types of imagination driving auditory cues.
In high school, I couldn't wait to get off the bus so I could go put the turntable on and listen to Till Eulenspiegel's Merry Pranks. And his French horn, full range, and it just brought joy to me.
Yeah, well, it's like Bugs Bunny.
Yes.
But I just interviewed a guy who talked about all the theme songs for Gilligan's Island and Bonanza and all those things. And you can't even imagine a Star Wars movie without John Williams.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But why? I'm trying to get you guys to tell me why. Well, I mean, and the book is based on your appendix is based on, okay, what grabbed you? And so you're saying that everybody is grabbed by something else generally. Yes, I may be feeling an afternoon of a fawn, someone may be feeling a car chase, but you're specifically saying what grabbed you. And it's not going to be the same answer for everybody else. It's going to be different answers for everybody.
But I think what you're saying is also different depending on the context, right? So you think of John Williams music and Star Wars, all right? You see Darth Vader in his black uniform and his breathing, and he's looking very ominous. And you hear da, 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 right? Very dark, very heavy music, very foreboding music, and a very foreboding image that goes with it. Now, play that same music and have Annie from the musical come out on stage and start dancing. There's going to be a disconnect, right? That doesn't make sense unless Annie has a knife behind her back, right? So I think we know that soundtracks work because they accentuate the message of what you're seeing on the screen or on the stage.
Congruence, yeah.
And it's congruence, and if it's discongruent, it can bring up some interesting problems for us that it can be kind of entertaining as well. I think about Pulp Fiction, for example.
Yeah.
Right. There's some really fun, happy music there for people who are really pretty dark in terms of what they're doing. Right. So
yeah, the juxtaposition and when they're fighting in the snow.
Oh yeah.
The music is not necessarily any, but yeah, Quentin Tarantino is a genius of that, of the juxtaposition. This is not the music that should be playing for what they're doing right now.
Right.
But that, so,
But that also, I think that also takes it out of the realm of normal reality, right? So, so when I hear a really dark song while I'm seeing a visual of something that's really happy and uplifting, or even cartoonish and silly, I'm not thinking, wow, this isn't real. It's kind of funny because there is this juxtaposition, right? But if I'm seeing something very dark and I'm having very dark music, I'm taking that darkness to a whole new level, because the music is now driving this incredible emotional, scary or loving or uplifting, whatever the music is doing, scene to something that's much more impactful without the music.
Well, as far as the brain is concerned, then when you're watching a movie, whether it's Star Wars or Pulp Fiction, your brain is doing double time, because it's looking and it's hearing and it's correlating the two.
Right.
So is everything kind of activated all at once?
You're pairing music or film together, right? You're pairing two stimuli together, one auditory, one visual. And now years later, when you hear that music, you're going to come back to that scene in Star Wars or that scene in Pulp Fiction. And that might change the whole outlook you have on that music. If it was a popular piece of music that you just used to hum to and thought was really fun, and now it's paired with this horrific murder scene or something, it's going to change that music for you and what it means to you, and what kind of memories it builds up when you hear it again.
Well, okay, your guys' your own lives. Why is, like you say, smell to me is very evocative. Like if I smell burning leaves, the classic one, I think back when I was 11 and Halloween and going door to door, it just clicks. And music is as evocative in so many ways, like your first song together, or, you know, my mom died 4 years ago and I could be in the supermarket and they're playing the song and I just stop and she's alive again.
Right.
She really is. It's not like it's fake. She is alive at that moment in my head. So why are these things evocative? What area of the brain is saying, yeah, this is very important to me?
This is part of the limbic system, right? So it's the hippocampus, which is involved in learning and memory, and your limbic system, like the amygdala and other areas that are responsible for sort of our emotional responses to things, mixed in with your cortex and everything else. But basically, you know, when we have these strong associations, they are very powerful for bringing back memory. I think this is another reason why music is a powerful thing for the human experience, because we use song or musical numbers to again unite people, but also to drive messages home. It's used in religion all the time, for example, right? And so the composer wants you to think about something specific when you play that particular music. Not always, but sometimes. And that's because our brain is so strongly taking that musical stimulus and saying, this is associated with X, Y, or Z. So this particular music is associated with my wedding day, or this particular music is associated with the time I first fell in love, or this music was something I was listening to when I saw an explosion, right? And those are tied just intimately together because our memory is being tied and associating the music with all the other cues that we have with certain important events in our life.
So Dennis, and I guess both of you, when you were young, did you go to church every Sunday?
I did.
And what was the music there that connected you as close to God? Was it Bach? It would have been for me.
Well, I would have to say that the music, it was the air I breathed. I played piano or organ or trumpet in the little orchestra, but I knew only that way of life as a quote church musician. And when it was a Pentecostal church, so the musical taste buds that now I use the word they had, and I was developing were worlds apart, and I had to have a nice attitude, because that was part of the whole church experience, was being a good boy. So I was fitting in, had kind of two lives, one that would be listening to Beethoven symphonies, but the church would have nearly frowned on it, not for moral reasons, but just like, you're supposed to be listening to, quote, Christian music.
What about you, Larry? Oh, you're on mute, Larry.
Yeah, sorry. I didn't want to. Our dogs just started barking there in the background. Yeah. So actually, I'm Jewish, so I used to go to temple in the morning. But music is a huge part of services in Jewish ceremonies. So, but that music was really different from everything I was listening to or learning outside the temple. So, but I have to say, if I go to a synagogue now, and hear music that reminds me of that, it brings me back. It brings me back to that time when I was a kid, listening to those same pieces of music, some of which date back thousands of years, right? So it's very powerful. I think religion and music are interesting, because if you look at most world religions, there is a musical component to almost every single one of them.
Adon Olam is the song that does it for me.
Oh, Adon Olam, yeah, it's funny. My version of Adon Olam that I grew up was Adon Olam Asher Molach. Yep. But of course, then there was the one that we did in the children's services, was to the tune of the William Tell Overture. So Adon Olam Asher Molach. So
it's really a kick-ass song.
It is, actually. You can do it almost any kind of things. I'm sure someone's put it to Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin too, but. Yeah, the religious connections with music are amazing to me, because religion has driven the evolution of music in so many ways. I think about gospel music in this country. I mean, that drove so many different genres of music that came out of the gospel traditions.
That's how we got the Beatles.
You bet, and everything that came after, right? So, but if you look in other countries, every religion has some music, almost every, there's a few exceptions, but almost every religion has a musical component. And it comes back to what we're talking about before: memory, ritual. All these things are kind of encompassed in music, and that's what brings people back and unifies people in groups. And religions are groups, so obviously. And so I think it's an amazing thing that we do as humans.
Well, as we wind down and end this, that was a good cue for the idea that, when you said earlier on, I didn't want this to be just another book about neuroscience and music, and you just went way off on something that was exactly not that simple book. And I think Dennis's assistance and you wanting to start out that way, and here we end up talking about these things that really don't have anything to do with like a real clinical, medical, scientific view of it. So I think so me again, rambling on, but what would you like your readers, and this again as a bookseller is really important to me, what would you like them to take away from this collaboration that's so well done?
Well, other than, as we say in the opening, that you should never turn away a discussion at 6 o'clock in the morning when you're standing naked in a gym. I think for me, the thing that I thought was most disturbing when I did my postdoctoral work in Germany, where music and everything else, it was so celebrated and so well supported by the government for public works and everything else. And when I came back to this country, it was an era when there was a lot of shortages of funding for schools. And I was noticing that time after time, the music program was the one that got kicked out of the program to save money. Somehow sports never was. And I love sports, don't get me wrong. I think kids need to get outside and move just as much as they need to hear music, but they need to hear music. They need to be involved in music. And what the research in this book that we cover says is music is incredibly important to human brain development, to human brain maintenance, and even to human brain repair. And if we turn our backs on it, we're doing a huge disservice to people. So that's one thing I personally would like to get the message out for. My other thing is, I think it just raises so many questions about how we learn and how we teach and what happens to the brain when we're engaged in optimal levels of learning and teaching. And that's that's be it music or anything else, and how we can challenge our brains and actually change our brains through those challenges.
What do you say, Dennis?
I would want everybody to consider involving themselves more seriously and intentionally in music making, and music listening. Taking an instrument, getting involved in singing, developing their ear training, somehow involved in making music for the sake of their brain, a whole brain. I have yet to meet a person who had a lot of music in their early life, who at age 40 and 60 is not, they're aware that developed them in an unusual way, more holistically.
It's funny. And one of the first things that attracts me to people is if they laugh. If they don't laugh, I'm not really going to spend any time with them. And the same thing to you, I know, Dennis, and to me too, is that if they like music, they can't really be a bad person. They have to be kind of good. And so anyway, so at the beginning, I thought this book was going to be, I was a little nervous. I thought it was not going to be accessible, but and one of the reviews kind of said that, and I'm saying, no, it's accessible to everybody. There's no part in there that you can't understand. And yeah, so I'm looking forward to having it in the window of our bookstore and on the front table. And I want to thank both of you so much for taking the time today to talk to me about it.
Been a joy. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.